The bridge didn't collapse because he failed. It collapsed because nobody listened. The sentence appeared in no official report, no headline, and no government statement that morning. But it was the truth Elijah Carter carried silently as he stood beneath the gray skies of Savannah, Georgia, watching thousands of people search for answers after the Savannah River Bridge disaster. At 19 years old, Elijah was the youngest person standing in the crowded investigation room, and somehow, he was also the person everyone had already decided to blame. Cameras flashed outside the Georgia Department of Transportation building as reporters repeated the same question. Who was responsible? The answer came faster than the evidence. A young black engineering intern, a poor kid from the south side of Savannah. Someone without a powerful last name or a political connection. Elijah stood near the back of the room wearing a simple navy work jacket with a faded engineering badge attached to the front. His hands held a folder filled with technical drawings, inspection notes, and months of warnings that had never received serious attention. Across the room, officials in expensive suits spoke in careful voices about accountability and responsibility. Governor William Harrison watched from the front table, his expression serious as advisors whispered beside him. "The public needs clarity," one official said quietly. "They need someone who failed to identify the danger." Elijah heard those words. He felt every syllable land like a weight, because he knew what the public did not know yet. He had identified the danger. Months earlier, Elijah had submitted detailed reports showing unusual stress patterns beneath the bridge's support structure. He had measured vibrations, studied load changes, and created simulations late into the night inside his small apartment near downtown Savannah. His conclusion had been simple. The bridge needed immediate reinforcement, but when he presented his findings, some people saw his age before they saw his work. They saw his neighborhood before they saw his calculations. They saw a 19-year-old black engineer instead of a professional who had spent years studying how to keep people safe. "You're talented, Elijah," one senior employee had told him. "But sometimes experience matters more than theories." Elijah had nodded respectfully. He always did, but he never stopped believing the numbers. Now, standing in the investigation room, he watched his warnings sit ignored inside a folder while people searched for a person to blame. A reporter approached him after the meeting. "Elijah Carter? Are you saying the collapse was not your fault?" The room became quiet. Microphones turned toward him. For a moment, Elijah looked at the faces around him. Some were curious, some were doubtful, some had already made their decision. He could have shouted, he could have defended himself with anger. Instead, he calmly opened the folder in his hands. "I'm saying the bridge gave warnings," Elijah said, "and those warnings were there for anyone willing to look." The reporter leaned closer. "Are you accusing the department of ignoring safety concerns?" Elijah paused. His eyes moved toward the window, where emergency crews and investigators continued their work in the distance. "I'm saying the truth was available before the accident happened." His answer spread quickly across the news. But not everyone wanted to hear it. Behind closed doors, powerful people discussed how to control the situation. They called Elijah inexperienced. They questioned his judgment. They suggested his calculations were incomplete. They never asked why he had been the first person to notice the problem. They never asked why he kept trying to warn them. They never asked why a young man with so little power had spent so much time protecting strangers he had never met. And while the world focused on blaming Elijah Carter, nobody yet knew the most important part of the story. Before the bridge investigation began, before the headlines, before his name became attached to a disaster, Elijah had already saved a life connected to the most powerful person in Georgia, a life belonging to someone the governor loved more than anything. And when Governor William Harrison finally discovered who Elijah really was, the truth would change everything. Elijah Carter had learned something important long before people started saying his name on television. The truth does not always arrive with a crowd behind it. Sometimes it sits quietly in a room, waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. Years before the investigation rooms, the headlines, and the questions from reporters, Elijah was just a young man trying to prove that his ideas mattered. He grew up in a modest neighborhood on the southern side of Savannah, Georgia, where the sound of morning buses and construction crews became part of his daily life. His mother, Denise Carter, worked long shifts as a nurse at a local medical center, and she raised Elijah with two simple rules. Work hard and never ignore someone who needs help. "Your name does not decide your worth," she would tell him when people underestimated him. "Your choices do." Elijah carried those words everywhere. While other teenagers spent their evenings chasing distractions, He spent his nights studying bridge designs, transportation systems, and structural safety. His small bedroom was filled with notebooks, engineering textbooks, and printed research papers. The desk near his window was covered with sketches of support systems and handwritten calculations. To Elijah, bridges were more than steel and concrete. They were promises. Promises that people could travel home safely to their families. During his engineering program at Georgia Southern University, professors noticed something different about him. He was not the loudest student in the room. He did not demand attention. But when a problem appeared, Elijah stayed with it until he understood every detail. Dr. Emily Brooks, a respected structural engineer who supervised his internship, remembered the first time she reviewed his work. "Most students look for the answer," she told him. "You look for why the problem exists." Elijah simply smiled and replied, "Because if we only fix what we see, we miss what is underneath." That mindset eventually brought him to the Savannah River Bridge project. At first, nobody expected a 19-year-old intern to make a major discovery. Elijah was there to assist with inspections, organize reports, and learn from experienced engineers. But during one routine review, he noticed patterns that others had overlooked. The measurements showed unusual vibration changes during heavy traffic periods. Certain areas of the bridge were experiencing stress levels that did not match previous predictions. Elijah checked the data again. Then again, he stayed after hours under the bright fluorescent lights of the engineering office, comparing reports and reviewing every number. Finally, he prepared a detailed analysis. It was clear, organized, and supported by evidence. The bridge needed additional reinforcement and a deeper inspection. When Elijah presented his findings, the reaction was not what he expected. One senior official glanced through the pages and leaned back in his chair. "You are saying the entire structure needs attention because of your calculations?" he asked. Elijah remained calm. "I am saying the data shows a risk we should investigate." Another engineer looked at the report and said, "You have good instincts, Elijah, but this is a major transportation system. Decisions like this are not made by someone with limited field experience." The words stayed with him, not because they were harsh, but because they reminded him of something he had experienced many times before. People often noticed his age before they noticed his ability. They noticed where he came from before they noticed what he could do. Still, Elijah did not stop. He updated his analysis. He added more information. He sent additional notes through the proper channels. Every message was professional. Every warning was respectful. He was not trying to prove that he was smarter than anyone else. He was trying to prevent something from happening. One evening, as Elijah sat alone in the engineering office reviewing another set of bridge measurements, Dr. Emily Brooks walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside him and looked at the screen. "You know most people would have given up by now," she said. Elijah looked down at the data. "If I stop because people do not believe me, then what happens if I was right?" Emily was quiet for a moment. She knew that answer. She also knew Elijah was carrying a responsibility that many older engineers would have struggled with. What she did not know was that the young man sitting in front of her had already made a decision that would soon connect him to the governor's family in a way nobody could have predicted. A decision that would reveal the kind of person Elijah Carter truly was when nobody was watching. Governor William Harrison had spent most of his career believing that every crisis had a solution if the right people were placed in the right positions. For decades, he had built a reputation as a leader who stayed calm under pressure, made difficult decisions, and carried the weight of responsibility on behalf of millions of people across Georgia. But the morning after the Savannah River Bridge disaster, the pressure surrounding him felt different. The questions were louder. The cameras were closer, and everyone wanted a name. Inside the governor's office in Atlanta, Georgia, sunlight passed through tall windows and reflected across a polished wooden table covered with reports, photographs, and official documents. Harrison stood quietly as his advisors reviewed the situation. "We need to show the public that we are taking action," one advisor said. "People are scared. They want accountability." Harrison looked down at the documents in front of him. He had spent years understanding politics, but he knew moments like this were not only about facts, they were about trust. "Who signed off on the final inspection?" he asked. A transportation official opened a folder. "Elijah Carter," he answered. The room became still for a moment. Harrison looked at the file. A photograph of Elijah was attached to the report. A young man, 19 years old, a student engineer, someone who did not fit the image of the person Harrison expected to be connected to such a serious failure. "He was responsible for the bridge?" Harrison asked. The official carefully chose his words. He was involved in the inspection process. That sentence was repeated throughout the day, on television, in online articles, in conversations between people who had never met Elijah. Incomplete information became a complete story before anyone had taken the time to understand the full picture. But inside the governor's office, one person was not convinced. Dr. Emily Brooks reviewed the investigation materials again and again. She knew Elijah's work. She knew his process. She knew he had spent months raising concerns. She walked into the governor's meeting room carrying a folder of her own. "Governor, there is more you need to see," she said. Harrison looked up. "About Carter?" Emily nodded. "About the warnings he submitted before the collapse." One of the officials at the table sighed. "Dr. Brooks, we cannot turn this into a debate about a young intern's opinions." Emily placed the folder down. They were not opinions. They were engineering observations supported by data. Harrison opened the folder. Inside were pages of technical analysis, diagrams, and time-stamped reports. The documents showed Elijah had identified unusual structural patterns months earlier. Harrison studied the pages carefully. "Why was this not included in the first briefing?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. That silence told him more than words could. Meanwhile, back in Savannah, Elijah watched the news coverage from his mother's small kitchen. The television showed his picture again. His name appeared beneath words that felt impossible to ignore. Suspect, failure, mistake. Denise Carter turned down the volume. She looked at her son sitting quietly at the table. "You know who you are," she said. Elijah looked at the papers beside him. "I know, Mom. But sometimes knowing the truth about yourself does not stop people from believing something else." Denise reached across the table and placed her hand on his notebook. "Your father used to say something. A person who builds things cannot spend all their time fighting people who tear things down." Elijah gave a small smile. It was the same lesson he had carried his entire life. Keep doing what is right, even when nobody is watching. That evening, Governor Harrison returned to his office alone. He looked again at Elijah's report. The details were too precise to dismiss. The timeline was too clear to ignore. Then he noticed something unusual in the technical notes, a symbol at the bottom of the document. A design mark connected to a safety system he had seen before, a system that had protected someone very close to him months earlier. Harrison leaned closer to the page. His expression changed. For the first time since the investigation began, he was no longer looking at Elijah Carter as a name in a report. He was looking at a person whose story he had never bothered to hear. And soon, he would discover that the young engineer everyone wanted to blame had already done something that would change the way he saw him forever. The symbol at the bottom of Elijah Carter's engineering report was small, almost invisible among the pages of technical notes and calculations. But to Governor William Harrison, it felt like a door opening to a memory he had tried to forget. He reached for the document again, his fingers resting on the printed mark near the corner of the page. It was the same design pattern he had seen months earlier during one of the most frightening days of his life. At the time, he had never asked who created it. He had only remembered one thing. His son was safe because someone had acted quickly, now that someone had a name. Elijah Carter. The governor leaned back in his chair, staring at the report spread across his desk. For the first time since the bridge investigation began, doubt entered the room. Not the kind of doubt that created confusion. The kind that forced a person to question everything they thought they understood. "Get me the complete file on Elijah Carter," Harrison said to his assistant. "Not the summary. Everything." The assistant looked surprised. "Governor, the investigation team already reviewed his background." Harrison looked up. His voice remained calm, but there was a new seriousness in his expression. "Then review it again." Across town in Savannah, Elijah had no idea that the person with the most power in Georgia was finally looking deeper into the story. He was focused on something much smaller, a cup of coffee growing cold beside his laptop, a stack of unanswered messages, and the same engineering data he had been studying for months. Dr. Emily Brooks visited him that afternoon. She found him sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents and handwritten notes. "You are still working?" she asked. Elijah looked up. "People still need answers." Emily placed her bag down and studied him carefully. "Most people would be trying to protect themselves right now." Elijah looked at the screen. "If I only defend myself, the real problem stays hidden." Emily paused. She had worked with many engineers throughout her career, but she had rarely seen someone Elijah's age carry such a strong sense of responsibility. "Do you understand what is happening?" she asked. They are trying to make you the explanation because it is easier than admitting the system failed. Elijah was quiet. He looked through the window toward the streets of Savannah. Cars moved slowly through the afternoon traffic. People continued their daily lives, unaware of the decisions being made behind closed doors. A bridge is supposed to hold people up, Elijah finally said, not become something that brings people down because nobody wanted to listen. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Governor Harrison continued reading Elijah's records. The more pages he reviewed, the more uncomfortable he became. The official reports described Elijah as inexperienced, but the attached technical documents showed careful analysis, detailed observations, and repeated attempts to communicate concerns. Harrison noticed something else. Several of Elijah's warnings were submitted weeks before the final inspection. They were not hidden. They were not unclear. They were simply ignored. How did this happen? Harrison asked during a private meeting with transportation officials. One official shifted in his seat. Governor, young engineers sometimes overestimate risks. Harrison looked directly at him. Did you review his calculations? The room became quiet. Not personally, the official admitted. Harrison closed the file slowly. Then how did we decide he was wrong? Nobody answered. The question remained hanging in the room. Later that evening, Harrison watched an old security recording from the day his son Ethan had been helped during the highway accident months earlier. The footage was not clear. The camera angle was distant, but the details were enough. A young man wearing a simple jacket, a calm voice, a carefully designed safety device that prevented a terrible outcome. Harrison remembered Ethan's words afterward. Dad, he told me everything was going to be okay. At the time, Harrison thought it was just a kind stranger helping someone in need. He never imagined that same person would later stand accused by the public. He never imagined that the person who protected his family would be the person his administration questioned. The next morning, Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone around him. He requested Elijah Carter's presence at the governor's office, not as a suspect, not as someone being questioned, but as someone whose voice had been ignored for far too long. For Elijah, the invitation created more uncertainty than relief. He had spent days being treated like the problem. Now the governor wanted to speak with him. As he prepared to leave Savannah for Atlanta, Elijah looked at the engineering report one more time. The numbers had never changed. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone powerful enough to finally see it. The drive from Savannah to Atlanta felt longer than the miles between the two cities. Elijah Carter sat quietly in the passenger seat of his old car, watching Georgia's highways stretch beneath the morning light. The world outside continued moving as if nothing had changed. Trucks carried supplies down the interstate. Families traveled toward weekend plans. People crossed bridges every day without thinking about the engineering decisions behind them. But Elijah thought about those decisions constantly. Every number mattered. Every measurement mattered. Every warning mattered. When he arrived at the Georgia state capitol, the building looked exactly how he imagined it would. Tall columns, marble floors, people walking quickly with folders in their hands, and important conversations happening behind closed doors. It was a world built around influence, and Elijah knew he was entering it without any of the things that usually open doors. He did not have a powerful family name. He did not have political connections. He only had his work and the truth inside his reports. A staff member escorted him to a conference room where Governor William Harrison was already waiting. The governor stood near the window, looking over Atlanta's skyline. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Elijah expected questions. He expected suspicion. He expected the same doubt he had faced before. Instead, Harrison turned around and looked directly at him. Elijah Carter, the governor said. Thank you for coming. Elijah nodded. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain. Harrison studied him carefully. I have read your reports. Elijah remained still. Then you know I submitted concerns before the collapse. I do, Harrison replied. The room became quiet. Elijah placed a folder on the table. I am not here to blame anyone, Governor. I am here because people deserve to know why those warnings were missed. Harrison looked at the folder but did not open it immediately. You understand the pressure surrounding this situation? He asked. Yes, sir. People want answers. Elijah nodded. They do, but answers built on the wrong information do not help anyone. The governor looked at him for a moment. There was something different about Elijah's response. He was not angry. He was not trying to win an argument. He was simply trying to protect the truth. Before Harrison could respond, the door opened. Several officials entered with additional documents from the investigation team. Their expressions changed when they saw Elijah sitting across from the governor. One of them, Thomas Reynolds, the deputy director of transportation, cleared his throat. "Governor, we were not expecting this meeting to include Mr. Carter." Harrison looked at him. "Why not?" Thomas hesitated. "Because his involvement is already under review." Elijah heard the words but kept his expression calm. Harrison noticed. "Under review for what exactly?" Thomas opened a folder. "There are concerns about his judgment and experience level." Elijah looked down briefly. He had heard those words before. Judgment, experience, qualifications. Words that sounded professional but often carried a different meaning when spoken about someone like him. Harrison looked back at Elijah. "Did you submit these concerns before the collapse?" Elijah answered immediately. "Yes, sir," Thomas interrupted. "Governor, with respect, a 19-year-old intern cannot be expected to understand the full complexity of a major bridge system." Elijah turned toward him. "That is exactly why I asked for a full review. I did not claim to know everything. I asked the people with more experience to look closer." The room went silent. Emily Brooks, who had joined the meeting remotely, spoke through the conference screen. "That is correct. Elijah never tried to override anyone. He requested additional evaluation based on the data." Thomas looked uncomfortable, but the final responsibility was not his alone. Harrison leaned forward. "Then why is his name the first one people hear?" Nobody answered. The question exposed something everyone in the room understood. It was easier to point toward the youngest person involved. Easier to explain a complex failure by blaming someone with the least authority. Elijah looked at the documents on the table. "Governor, I know what people think when they see my name. They think I am too young. They think I do not belong in those rooms. But the bridge did not care who discovered the problem. It only cared whether someone listened." Harrison remained silent. Those words stayed with him. After the meeting ended, Elijah walked through the Capitol hallway alone. He passed portraits of former leaders, people whose names were remembered for generations. For a moment, he wondered if his own name would only be remembered as part of a mistake. Then his phone received a message from Emily. "Keep going. The truth is moving now." Elijah looked at the screen and took a slow breath. But outside the governor's office, another conversation was already happening. A group of officials who had built their careers around avoiding responsibility realized something dangerous. The governor was no longer looking for someone to blame. He was looking for the reason everyone had missed the truth. And that meant the people who ignored Elijah's warnings were beginning to face questions of their own. The hallway outside the governor's office became unusually quiet after Elijah Carter left the meeting room. The sound of footsteps moved across the marble floor, but the conversations that normally filled the Capitol building had changed. People were no longer speaking about a simple investigation. They were speaking about questions that had been ignored for too long. Inside the conference room, Governor William Harrison remained seated, looking at the documents Elijah had placed on the table. The pages were filled with technical information, but the most important part was not the numbers. It was the timeline. The warnings came first. The collapse came later. Harrison looked toward the officials around him. "Why was this information not part of the original briefing?" he asked. Thomas Reynolds shifted through his papers. "Governor, the initial focus was understanding the immediate causes." Harrison's expression remained steady. "Understanding the cause requires understanding everything that happened before it." Nobody responded. For years, Harrison had learned how government worked. Reports could be shortened, details could be delayed. Complex situations could be simplified for public explanation. But engineering did not work that way. A bridge did not fail because of a convenient story. It failed because of reality. And reality was beginning to show that Elijah Carter had been trying to reveal something everyone else had missed. Later that evening, Elijah returned to Savannah. The city looked different from the passenger window. The same streets, the same buildings, the same river flowing beneath the bridges. But after everything that happened, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He parked near the waterfront and sat quietly for a few minutes. The evening air was cool, and the lights from the city reflected across the water. For the first time in days, there was no camera pointed at him, no reporter asking questions, no officials judging him, just silence. Elijah opened his notebook and looked through the pages he had filled over the past year. Every calculation, every observation, every warning. He remembered the nights when he wondered if anyone would ever take him seriously. He remembered hearing that he was too young, that he needed more experience, that he should wait his turn. But he also remembered why he started studying engineering in the first place. When he was a child, he watched workers repair roads and bridges around Savannah. He was fascinated by how something built by people could carry thousands of lives every day. His mother once asked him why he cared so much about structures most people never noticed. Elijah answered, "Because the things people do not notice are sometimes the things protecting them." The next morning, Governor Harrison received another file. This one was not about the bridge. It was about his son, Ethan Harrison. Months earlier, Ethan had been traveling through Georgia when a dangerous situation developed on a highway outside Macon. A young man nearby noticed the issue and used a safety device he had created during his engineering research. That device helped protect Ethan until emergency assistance arrived. The report had been filed under the name of an unknown volunteer. The governor had never met him. He had never known who he was. Harrison opened the document slowly. At the bottom was the same design mark from Elijah's bridge report, the same symbol he had recognized before. His eyes moved across the page. The volunteer was listed as Elijah Carter. Harrison stopped reading. For several seconds, he simply stared at the name, the person his administration had questioned, the person the public had criticized, the person they described as inexperienced. He was the same person who had protected Harrison's son. The governor stood and walked toward the window. Outside, Atlanta continued moving. Cars passed through intersections. People walked along sidewalks. Thousands of lives continued because of decisions made by people they would never know. Harrison thought about the meeting with Elijah. He remembered the young engineer sitting calmly while others questioned his ability. He remembered the way Elijah spoke about safety, not recognition. He remembered the sentence that stayed with him. The bridge did not care who discovered the problem. It only cared whether someone listened. For the first time, Harrison understood the full weight of those words. Elijah had not been fighting for attention. He had been fighting for people who would never know his name. The governor picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Cancel my afternoon schedule," he said. "I need to make an announcement." But before he could speak publicly, he knew one thing had to happen first. He needed to return to Savannah. He needed to face the young man his office had almost turned into a symbol of failure. Because the truth was no longer hidden in a report. It was standing right in front of him, and it carried the name Elijah Carter. The morning sunlight reached Savannah slowly, spreading across the city streets and reflecting against the windows of small businesses, homes, and buildings that had witnessed the tension of the past several days. For Elijah Carter, the morning felt different. Not because the accusations had disappeared, not because everyone suddenly understood him, but because, for the first time, someone with the power to change the conversation had finally listened. Elijah was sitting inside a small coffee shop near the Savannah River when he saw the familiar black vehicles outside. He did not need anyone to tell him who had arrived. Governor William Harrison stepped through the door with only a small group of staff members. No cameras, no reporters, no public announcement, just a man walking into a room where he needed to have a conversation. Elijah stood as the governor approached. "Mr. Carter," Harrison said, "thank you for meeting with me." Elijah nodded. "Of course, Governor." They sat across from each other at a small table near the window. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. The sounds of the city filled the space between them. Coffee machines, passing cars, people beginning their day. Finally, Harrison placed a folder on the table. "I reviewed everything," he said. Elijah looked at the folder but said nothing. "Your reports, your warnings, your safety analysis, all of it." Harrison paused. "You were trying to prevent this." Elijah lowered his eyes for a moment. "Yes, sir." The governor took a breath. "And we did not listen." Those words carried more weight than Elijah expected. He had heard many explanations during the investigation. He had heard excuses. He had heard people defend decisions. But this was different. This was an admission. Harrison looked at him carefully. "There is something else I discovered." He opened another document and placed it on the table. Elijah glanced at the page. His expression changed slightly when he saw the design mark. "You created this system?" Harrison asked. Elijah looked back at him. "Yes. The emergency safety system used outside Macon last year?" Elijah nodded slowly. "A prototype version." The governor looked down. "That system helped protect my son." Silence filled the table. Elijah had never connected that moment with the governor. To him, it was simply a situation where someone needed help. He had seen a problem. He had used his knowledge. He had done what he believed anyone should do. Harrison studied the young engineer sitting across from him. "Do you know what surprised me most?" he asked. Elijah waited. It was not that you created something innovative. It was not that you identified a problem before experienced engineers did. Harrison looked toward the window. It was that you never mentioned helping my son, Elijah answered quietly. I did not do it so people would know my name. The governor remained silent. That sentence stayed with him. Because in a world where recognition often influenced decisions, Elijah had acted without expecting anything in return. Meanwhile, inside the transportation department, the investigation had begun changing direction. Independent engineers reviewed the original bridge documents and discovered multiple missed opportunities to address the concerns Elijah had raised. The problem was no longer about one young engineer's actions. It was about a system that had ignored information because it came from someone people underestimated. Dr. Emily Brooks joined the review meeting and placed Elijah's original reports on the table. These were not hidden warnings, she said. They were submitted through the correct channels. One investigator looked through the documents and quietly admitted, "We should have taken this more seriously." Back in Savannah, Elijah walked with Governor Harrison along the riverfront. The water moved calmly beneath the afternoon sky. The same river that had existed long before their disagreement. The same river that would continue long after their names disappeared from the headlines. Harrison stopped near the railing. "I owe you an apology." Elijah looked at him. "Governor, people made decisions based on what they knew." Harrison shook his head slightly. "No. Some decisions were made because people did not take the time to know you." Elijah did not respond immediately. He looked across the water. For years, he had wanted people to see his work before judging his background. Now, the person who represented the system that overlooked him was finally seeing the person behind the reports. Later that day, Governor Harrison prepared to address the public. The statement would not be about protecting a political image. It would not be about finding another person to blame. It would be about correcting a mistake. And when the cameras turned on, millions of people across Georgia would hear a name that had once been connected to failure. But this time, they would hear the truth behind it. The announcement from Governor William Harrison was broadcast across Georgia the following morning. People gathered around televisions in homes, offices, and restaurants as the governor stood behind a simple podium inside the state capitol building in Atlanta. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempt to avoid responsibility, just a serious expression from a man who knew the words he was about to say would change the way people viewed the entire investigation. "For the past several days, we have focused on finding someone to blame," Harrison began, "but the truth is more important than a convenient answer." The room behind him remained silent. Reporters waited with their cameras ready. "After a complete review of the evidence, we have determined that Elijah Carter did not cause the failure of the Savannah River Bridge. In fact, his reports identified concerns before the incident occurred. Across the state, people who had only known Elijah through headlines heard his name differently for the first time. He was no longer the young engineer people questioned. He was the person who had tried to warn them. In Savannah, Elijah watched the announcement with his mother, Denise, sitting quietly beside him. She looked at her son and saw the same person who had spent countless nights studying at the kitchen table. The same person who stayed late at work because he believed every detail mattered. "You always knew the truth would come out," she said softly. Elijah looked at the television screen. "I hoped it would." The governor continued speaking. He explained that an independent review would examine the decisions made before the bridge collapse. He acknowledged that warnings had been overlooked and that the responsibility extended beyond one individual. But the moment that surprised many people came near the end of his statement. "I also want to recognize someone who showed integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent," Harrison said. Elijah Carter did not seek attention. He did not ask for recognition. He simply tried to protect people. The words reached Elijah differently than any apology could. Because for months, he had not been fighting for praise. He had been fighting against being misunderstood. Later that week, Elijah returned to the Georgia Department of Transportation building. The same hallway that once felt cold and unfamiliar now felt different. People who had avoided eye contact before stopped to speak with him. Some apologized. Others simply told him they appreciated his dedication. One engineer approached him near the entrance. "I owe you an apology," the man said. Elijah looked surprised. "For what?" The engineer lowered his voice. "For assuming your age meant you could not be right." Elijah nodded slowly. "The important thing is that we learn from it." The engineer smiled slightly. "That sounds like something you would say." Nearby, Dr. Emily Brooks watched the exchange. She knew Elijah had every reason to be bitter. He had been questioned. He had been ignored. He had watched strangers judge him without knowing his story. But instead of seeking revenge, he chose something harder. He chose understanding. A few days later, Governor Harrison invited Elijah to the Capitol again. This time, the meeting was different. There were no accusations, no defensive conversations, no doubt about whether Elijah belonged in the room. Harrison walked with him through the building and stopped near a display showing important engineering achievements across the state. "I used to think leadership was about making the right decision quickly," Harrison said. "I was wrong." Elijah listened. "Sometimes leadership means admitting when you failed to listen." The governor looked at him. "You reminded me of that." Elijah answered, "Everyone can miss something. The important part is what happens after." Those words stayed with Harrison, because they represented the difference between a mistake and a lesson, between pride and growth. As weeks passed, Elijah continued working on transportation safety projects throughout Georgia. His ideas received more attention, but he remained the same person. He still carried the same notebook. He still checked every calculation twice. He still believed that the purpose of engineering was not recognition, it was protection. And while the public finally saw the truth about Elijah Carter, the most meaningful change was not the headlines or the official statements. It was something much quieter. People who once judged him by his age, his background, and his appearance began to understand that talent does not come with a certain look, a certain neighborhood, or a certain last name. Sometimes the person with the least power is the person holding the answer everyone needs. And sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that refused to stop telling the truth. 1 year later, the Savannah River looked exactly the same. The water moved beneath the bridge with the same quiet rhythm, carrying reflections of the morning sun across the surface. Cars traveled above it every day. Families crossed it on their way to work. Students rode across it on their way to school. Most people never thought about the engineering behind the structure beneath their tires. They simply trusted that someone had done the work carefully. For Elijah Carter, that trust was the reason he had never given up. On a clear autumn morning in Savannah, Georgia, Elijah stood near the completed safety inspection area of the newly reinforced bridge. He was no longer the young engineer people questioned in headlines. He was now part of a team responsible for improving transportation safety across the state. But despite everything that had changed, he still carried the same worn notebook he had used during his internship. The pages were filled with calculations, sketches, and ideas written in his careful handwriting. Dr. Emily Brooks walked beside him, looking at the finished project. "You know what is interesting?" she said. Elijah looked over. "What?" "A year ago, people thought you were trying to prove something." She smiled slightly. "But you were never trying to prove you were smarter than anyone else." Elijah looked across the bridge as vehicles passed safely above the river. "I just wanted people to get home." Emily nodded. She had heard him say similar things many times before, but that simple answer was exactly what made Elijah different. He never measured success by attention. He measured it by lives protected and problems prevented. A few minutes later, Governor William Harrison arrived at the bridge site. His position had not changed. He was still the governor of Georgia. He still carried the responsibilities of leadership. But the way he looked at Elijah had changed completely. The two men stood together near the safety structure that represented a difficult lesson for everyone involved. "A lot has changed since the first time we met," Harrison said. Elijah smiled. "Yes, sir, it has." The governor looked at the bridge. "I have spent my career making decisions, but I learned something from you." Elijah waited. Sometimes the person with the least authority in the room can see the most important thing. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved gently across the bridge. The sound of passing cars filled the silence. Harrison continued. "I wish I had listened sooner." Elijah looked toward the river below. "The important thing is that people listened eventually." That answer stayed with the governor, because forgiveness did not mean pretending mistakes never happened. It meant choosing what to do after recognizing them. The investigation had led to changes in how safety reports were reviewed. New procedures were created to ensure that concerns from engineers at every level received proper attention. Young professionals entering the field were encouraged to speak when they noticed something unusual. Elijah's story became a reminder that experience mattered, but curiosity mattered too. Knowledge could come from unexpected places. A year after everything began, Elijah returned to the same small neighborhood where he grew up. The streets were familiar. The houses were familiar. The people who knew him before anyone else celebrated his success were still there. His mother, Denise, stood outside their home as he arrived. She looked at him and smiled. "Your father would have been proud," she said. Elijah looked down for a moment, remembering the lessons that shaped him. He always told me to do the right thing, even when nobody notices. Denise nodded. And now people notice. Elijah smiled, but he knew recognition was never the reason he started. That evening, he returned to the bridge one final time. The sky above Savannah turned golden as the sun moved lower. The structure stretched across the river, strong and steady. There were no cameras, no reporters, no crowds, just the sound of the wind and the movement of people safely traveling home. Elijah placed his hand on the railing and looked across the bridge he had once warned others about. The same place where his voice had been ignored became the place where his work was finally understood. He did not need a statue. He did not need applause. The strongest proof was already there. Every car that crossed, every family that arrived safely, every person who never knew his name but benefited from his effort. The world had once judged Elijah Carter before understanding him. But in the end, the truth did not need permission. It only needed time. And above the Savannah River, beneath the quiet light of the evening sky, a young engineer who was once overlooked finally saw what he had always believed. The greatest measure of a person is not the power they hold. It is the good they choose to do when nobody is watching.